So, Lisa, I hear you have a statistic that you're bringing to the podcast today.
I do. In fact, Pew Research put out a new report not long ago. They surveyed some people, a large number of people, and 70% of those people were in favor of the idea of municipal networks. 70%.
That's a huge percentage. That must mean that we have great policies and that the big companies are following public opinion on this, right?
Oh, well, maybe that's not exactly what it means.
All right, well, let's dig into this a little bit more on this episode of Building Local Power. My name is Nick Stumo-Langer, and I am the communications manager here for the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. And on the line with me is Lisa Gonzalez, the senior researcher for the Community Broadband Networks Initiative. So say hi, Lisa.
Hi, Lisa. Hi, Nick.
And today is going to be a little bit different format for the podcast. We're going to do a little bit of a roundtable with some of our experts, just talking about the ways that large companies and concentrated economic power is reacting to local communities asserting their will and building local power. So why don't we dig into this with our co-director and the initiative director of the Community Scaled Economies Initiative, Stacy Mitchell.
Hey, Nick.
Hi, Stacy. So why don't we kind of frame this issue a little bit and maybe just do a little bit of discussion on what we're talking about and how these big corporate entities are reacting to communities that exert local power.
Well, what we're seeing as more communities stand up for themselves and try to chart their own future is that a lot of big companies are coming in and they're either using false information or a sense of fear or other manipulative tactics to try to get their own way and to block communities from being able to do what they want to do. And sometimes we even see them, using really sort of stealth means to kind of co-opt local markets.
What kind of fears are they stoking? What kind of apocalypse are they crafting for these local communities?
At the Community Scaled Economy Initiative, we work a lot on consolidation and particularly big retailers. And so we help a lot of communities fight Walmart and Target and other big companies from coming in, support local businesses. And one of the things that we see in those fights when say Walmart wants to build a store and a community is like, no, we think you've got enough market power here. You don't need any more stores in our area. Or we want to place limits on you. You can't build such a big store, or you have to pay higher wages, or in some other way really benefit the community. What we see Walmart often doing is running these very elaborate public relations campaigns where they basically say, if you don't let us in, your whole economy is going to tank. You're not going to have jobs. We're just going to go to the town next door and build there, and we'll destroy your local economy anyway. That you're going to be left behind. And of course, in this economy, when a lot of people are really struggling to make ends meet, the idea of losing out on jobs and growth is a big deal. And so that can really work in Walmart's favor if they're effective at doing it.
It seems like a really insidious form of fear of missing out, FOMO, except the end result seems to be that your economy will be destroyed.
Yeah, and there's all kinds of evidence that shows exactly the opposite, that places that say no to big retailers are better off economically. They have higher median incomes, more income growth, more job growth. I mean, in all sorts of ways, the evidence really shows the opposite. But it's very easy for a big company like that to say, hey, look, we're going to create these jobs. We're going to grow your economy. And it seems truthful on the face of it. One of the other things we often see is companies will kind of do this inversion where they play to people's fear about being controlled by an outside entity. And even though in reality, they're the outside entity that wants to come in and control the local economy, what they do is place that on the city council. And so they create this campaign like the city council is like some kind of like global government coming in and, trying to intervene in the community's future and so on. Your city council is like made up of your neighbors. I mean, it's the city council, your government is you, especially at the local level, right? But Walmart will often, sort of run this public relations campaign like city government is just, like black helicopters from the UN are coming in to interfere in, your small town in Montana. And then, of course, in reality, what you have is this global corporation, that's bigger than many of the economies of the world actually coming in and wanting to rearrange your local community for its own benefit. That's the truth of the matter, but they do this sort of inversion process.
So you've got this situation where, in a lot of ways, you have a big entity like Walmart or other big box retailers, and they're coming in, they're squeezing out these local businesses. But I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the concentration in products, or the ways in which, you have certain local products that are really great. Craft beer is a good example of this, that's being co-opted by larger and larger entities. Maybe talk a little bit about something I know you call local washing.
Yeah, I mean, this is interesting because as we're seeing this like growth in craft beer and local food, we've seen some return of independent retail. There's a lot of interest and growing public support for those, kinds of locally produced products. And so what companies have begun to do is they've created like a stealth version of local. So for example, in the craft brewing space, there are a lot of craft beers that have been bought by Miller's Coors or by AB InBev, Anheuser-Busch, and they continue to operate them as though they're craft beers. You wouldn't know, standing in the grocery store aisle, that it's not an independent craft beer, but it isn't anymore. Some examples of this are Goose Island, sort of a famous craft brewery in Chicago, which is now owned by Anheuser-Busch. Golden Road in Los Angeles, also owned by Anheuser-Busch. Even Brooklyn Brewery now is a 25% stake in one of the largest, 25% of it is owned by one of the largest brewers in the world. And so this is one way that these companies are coming in and sort of tricking people into buying their products, people who are actually seeking out a locally produced craft beer. Even Walmart actually has its own craft beer. It's called Trouble Brewing. And it's got if you see the packaging, it's got all the hallmarks of an actual craft beer. They make a Belgian style wheat beer called Round Midnight, and they sell it at all their stores. It's mass produced through a private label arrangement, and they tuck it in with the other craft beers. It's not sold alongside Coors or Miller. It's there with the craft beers, and you would think that it's a local craft brewery, but in fact, it's a Walmart beer.
That sounds really disturbing, and I think Trouble Brewing is probably the best name I could think of for it. I'll share a little anecdote. I was in Chicago on a little trip back out east here to D.C., and I was walking around downtown Chicago, and I did notice there was a local pharmacy. It had the name of the neighborhood on it, and in very small letters on the bottom, it said a Rite Aid affiliate pharmacy. And that was something that was especially insidious that I definitely noticed. And I'm wondering, have you seen that happen in other places where, big retailers have grabbed up small local pharmacies or other retail businesses that they can just pass off as local?
Yeah. Funeral homes is a big one. Some big funeral home chains have rolled up all these local funeral homes, and they've kept the local name. And so, you would think that it was still local. Starbucks has quite a few stealth coffee shops. If you look very closely at the fine print somewhere in the space, it'll say by Starbucks, but you have to really be looking out. They all have unique names. There's one in Seattle that's called 15th and something. It's like the name of the actual street location. And they look like, it's got like reclaimed wood. It has all the hallmarks of an independent coffee shop that Starbucks has adopted. Even online, like Amazon, they're manufacturing more and more of the stuff that they sell. And so one area they're making a big push in is clothing. They're producing a lot, they're selling more and more clothing, and they're producing a lot of the clothing that they sell. But of course, most people, maybe you'd buy Amazon branded socks, but the idea of buying like an Amazon cocktail dress isn't, that's not really very appealing. So what Amazon has done is they've created all of these labels, like Larkin Row is one of them that sells women's fashions, and you would think this is a sort of independent fashion brand, but in fact, it's Amazon made clothing.
All right, Stacy. Well, thank you so much for joining us today for the podcast. And do you have any recommendations you'd like to give to our listeners for future reading or watching or listening?
I've been on vacation, so I've been, catching up on Spy Mysteries by Alan First, which is a lot of fun, but not really germane to our work.
No, I think that's fine. I'd love to. Like I said before, I'm going to be recommending a comic book at the end of this, so stay tuned for that. And it doesn't always have to be about local economy stuff, and that's just fine. Thank you so much, Stacy.
Thanks, Nick.
Our next guest is Energy Democracy Initiative Director John Farrell, and he'll be talking to us about the way that electric utilities are stoking some fear around renewable energy. John, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Nick.
So why don't you just give our audience a little bit of an overview of the kind of big issues you see around renewable energy and how utilities are stoking public ignorance about this?
Well, really, the key to understanding what's happening with utilities and with renewable energy is that for about 100 years, utilities have had a monopoly over the production of energy in our electricity system. And so they're not used to competition. And the entrance of new ways of producing energy, particularly solar power, which can be done at small scale, it can be done on rooftops, it can be owned by customers, is really a threat to their market share. And that's the way that they perceive it. And so you see them acting in a lot of different ways to resist the incursion of this competition into a market that they have comfortably controlled for decades.
That sounds like a big deal, and it sounds like a lot of fear around their own profit margins, really, if you're getting down to it. So have you seen any, glaring examples of this influence being used to tamp down renewable energy, especially locally owned renewable energy?
Yeah, there's a really good example, and it was good in the sense that it also turned out well for the locals. In Florida, in 2016, at the end of 2016, there was an initiative on the ballot that was placed there by the utility companies, and it was in language that couched it as a pro-solar amendment to the Constitution in Florida. But what it really would have done is prohibited the kind of third-party competition that the utilities were hoping to avoid. There are companies now that can come in and put solar on your roof and pay most of the upfront cost, and then you just sort of pay them back over time. And it's really a policy tool that has been a key part of the success and expansion of solar on both businesses and home rooftops in many different states. And these Florida utilities who were feeling threatened by this decided to invest millions of dollars in a ballot initiative, a very deceptive ballot initiative that touted itself as being pro-solar, but in reality was going to make it very, very difficult for solar to grow in the state of Florida, and ironically in what's called the Sunshine State. So the investor-owned utilities, the ones that are private companies that are owned by shareholders, who are many of them not Floridians, spent $20 million on this ballot initiative and an additional $9 million on political races, like for the legislature and the governor's office, in order to influence this vote. And were nearly successful, even though it was a 60% vote threshold in order to pass. And what really undermined them or caught them up was that a fellow advocate from some kind of AstroTurf, if you will, nonprofit organization that was purportedly for affordable energy, but was really about defending the utilities' interests, was caught on tape discussing this ballot initiative as a sort of form of political jujitsu that was, quote, an incredibly savvy maneuver that would completely negate anything the pro-solar advocates would try to do legislatively or constitutionally down the road. So it was it was acknowledged as a very deceptive tactic. And when that audio was released, it started off a tidal wave of opposition that eventually led to the ballot initiative's defeat. But it was a very near thing, and the utilities were very closely successful. Florida Power and Light put in $8 million by itself. It's the largest investor-owned utility in Florida. It was the most that had ever been spent on a ballot initiative in the history of the state of Florida. And again, they couched it all in this terms of being pro-solar, when really it was all about quashing competition.
So I want to pull on that thread just a little bit there. You're talking about how they are couching it in language that's pro-solar. I think that's something that we've consistently seen. You have a big company like Walmart that we talked about in our last segment. It's coming in and saying, we want to build your local economy, that type of thing. Or you have these large utilities saying, we want to build up renewable energy. We want to do this type of thing. How are their tactics really kind of obscuring the issue? And in what way are they actually taking power away from the local communities? Because, there are some people that would say, oh, more solar panels sounds great. Doesn't matter who owns them. But why is it important that local communities own the solar? and the renewables in general.
Well, let me just cover the first thing about in terms of the nature of the deception. One of the things that they highlighted was safety. And this is a common theme among utilities who use their they're sort of trusted as operators of the grid. And so they often couch their defense of their market share in terms of safety, that, the grid will be less reliable, for example, if we let more solar. They actually successfully recruited firefighters in order to appear in ads talking about, rooftop solar as a fire safety risk. In the end, when firefighters realized after the release of this audio that, in fact, this was a very deceptive amendment, not intended to be at all about safety and entirely about protecting their monopoly, the firefighters started to disavow that. But it's just an indication of one way in which the utilities have this fight. And what's really at stake here is an opportunity for us to fundamentally change the way that we are producing energy and consuming energy, and really where the dollar flows are in our energy system go. We spend $360 billion a year on electricity in the United States, and the technologies like solar or smartphones or electric vehicles are offering an opportunity for the first time for us to keep those dollars in our own pockets, whether it's participating by subscribing to a community solar array or putting solar on our own rooftop, or maybe contributing to doing that on our place of worship. So there's so many different ways in which we can really localize the dollars in our energy economy, create more local jobs, and create more competition, frankly, in our energy system. And the utility companies are, of course, very resistant to this, and unfortunately not willing to fight on fair terms, but rather are using the power of their incumbency, the fact that they collect all of our money right now as the monopoly company, to resist this change.
John, that's a great note to end it on. Thank you so much for joining us. I know you got to run, but do you have a recommendation for our listeners? Anything that you've been particularly enjoying?
Again, my reading has been on the fiction rather than the nonfiction side, but I read an excellent book called Paladin of Souls by Lois McMaster Bujold, and just finished it a couple days ago. Very good story. And as someone who's read a lot of fantasy novels over my lifetime, some very novel approaches to storytelling in that book. So I'd recommend it.
That's great. Thank you so much, John.
Thanks, Nick.
And now joining us for our third segment is Lisa Gonzalez, back from the beginning of the show, and Christopher Mitchell, the director of our Community Broadband Networks Initiative. Why don't you say hi?
Hey, I'm excited to be here. Hey, Nick, in a lot of podcasts right now, this is a moment in which you might hear an advertisement. You might hear someone say, Rocket Home Mortgage is really the best place for you to go and get your mortgages. And we know from a previous show that that's actually not the case, that in fact, you'd be much better off sticking with your local banks to make sure you're getting the best deal and make sure that you're really supporting that local economy. But I don't know if you've noticed or not, we don't have any advertisements in this show, but we are always looking for people to support our work and to make sure we can keep doing it. And so let me just really encourage you to head on over to ILSR.org, find the donate button, give us a few bucks, and help us to keep it going. So that's our advertisement. It is not what we normally hear, but I wanted to make sure people were just thinking about the fact that if we wanted to take advertising, it would be very difficult. And one of the reasons you hear from these big national companies on advertising is because local advertising on podcasts can be quite difficult. So support us instead, support your local businesses, and just consider that to be doing your part. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Chris. So Christopher Mitchell, everybody give him your money. So why don't we start with talking about how these large companies are responding to local power in the form of municipal broadband networks. I know we have a lot of stuff to say on this, but Chris, why don't you just start off giving an overview of the company response to municipal networks?
Well, I think we could break it into two large categories that are not exclusive, but two things that immediately come to mind are, one, big lobbying campaigns in state capitals as well as in the federal government to basically prohibit that competition of local community-owned networks. And the second broad category would be seemingly academic studies or studies from seemingly independent groups that are talking about how municipal networks are bad investments. We recently just responded to one, which was I was actually comparing it to Macedonian fraudsters inventing stories about Pizzagate abductions, because it was so crazy. And it's from that was from the Taxpayer Protection Alliance, which has zero credibility in terms of their ability to correctly describe what's happening factually, let alone a judgment as to whether or not these networks are succeeding. But on the other end of the scale, appearing to be academically rigorous, is a study that just came out from the University of Pennsylvania Law School. A professor there who runs a center on technology that receives a lot of money from big incumbent telephone and cable companies, Christopher Yu, has released a study in which he claims that most municipal networks are losing money and will not break even. And his data is really quite inappropriate for the methodology he used. And in the next day or so, we'll be releasing a paper that explains the holes in his argument, as well as, I think, some of the bias that we see in it that makes it just seem a little less credible to us.
So why are these, Taxpayers Protection Alliance, these academics, why are they releasing these types of things? What are they trying to do? Are they trying to keep what we have? Are they trying to change something? What's their goal?
Well, I think that, Christopher already touched on one aspect, and that is, they get a lot of their support from the corporations that are trying to limit competition. But realistically, I think they also believe what they're saying. And one of the things about the report that I thought was disturbing, for lack of a better word, is using the methodology that they used to analyze something that it was like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. We're talking about a service that is not a nicety, but a necessity. And basically they're talking about analyzing something based on net present value. How much cash flow does it make? How much profit does it make? But there's a lot more to municipal networks than just turning a profit. And so, one of the reasons why they do this, I believe, is first of all, to continue to garner support from the corporations that back them, but also because they believe in what they're saying. And we just feel that it's incorrect and simplistic.
One of the things that I would add on to that, and I definitely agree with Lisa, and I think the larger dynamic is not so much that you have an industry that has a ton of money, and therefore people are trying to figure out how to sell out and just lie baldly about their intentions. There's a little bit of that, and I don't think that we should discount that. But, a lot of these groups, and in particular the academics, I think, are people that have honest beliefs that the Comcast and AT&T way is the best way, that these economies of scale that come from the larger companies are going to end up doing better for the economy and things like that. And now the challenge is that in a system in which, if I was in academia with my views and Christopher Yu is in academia with his views, it's going to be a lot easier to run a department with him because he's going to get all kinds of industry funding. I'm not, right? Like, I'm going to be supporting local groups that don't have the money to endow chairs at university programs and things like that. And so I think it's really important to note how these kinds of studies can come about just because of the incentives around the university system, around nonprofits getting funded. It is not an equal playing field in the marketplace of ideas out there for the ideas that we put forth in terms of strong local economies, compared to the ideas of the big companies, whether it's, Stacy talking about the brewers or the John talking about the energy companies. There's a strong bias against us because there's not as much money on our side to support nonprofit organizations that have our mission. In many ways, our power is dispersed, and we like it that way.
That's a great point. And I think one of the things that really struck me in reading some of the reaction to this report, and especially the internal conversations we've been having that you will be publishing the report, is that there are basic errors that could be corrected in this report that could have been figured out if they had talked to the people running these networks. I think something that really struck me is that there are communities that have seen the benefits of these municipal networks. They have better connectivity. They have a booming small business sector because of it. They're an attractive place to live. And the authors of this report or this study did not, think that that was a necessary positive impact. And that was something that they didn't want to talk about. I'll also kind of transition here to make sure we're connecting all the threads here. Like you were saying, is there a way that these companies or these studies that come out from the funding of these companies are stoking any ignorance as far as internet access goes? Or are they stoking any fear as far as reliability? Is that part of the equation here?
To some extent, yes. What's more of a head-to-head kind of thing? I mean, one of the dirty tactics we have seen is where the big cable company or the big telephone company goes door to door against the municipal network and tells people, oh, the municipal network is failing. Look at this study that says it's losing money. It's probably going to be sold soon. Now's the time to get a 2-year deal with us when we'll give you a good deal. If you stick around as customers for them, you're eventually going to have to take service from someone else, and you're not going to have this great deal available to you. And we do see that. We certainly see some of those kinds of dirty tricks. We also see that, Comcast rebrands as Xfinity, and Charter is now Spectrum, and they try to leave their names behind because they have such a bad reputation in a number of cases. So those are some tactics we've seen, but really it's more, I think there's been more of an effort on the academic side and the nonprofit side to prove that these municipal networks are just bad investments, and they usually try to play on some anti-government hype, but as you know, most Americans still strongly support the ability of communities to build their own networks.
Nick, I just want to add to that also. That brings up, in my mind, the idea of this boondoggle map from the Taxpayers Protection Alliance and how easy it is to pass about misinformation. The map, if you just go look at the map, the first thing that's in your face is this map with all these dots on it, and the idea is you look at the map and there's all these failures. Well, even by their own standards, their own definition of failure, it's only less than 10% of the dots that they have on their own map. So the first thing you see is a map with a bunch of failures. But even when you look at their own map, they have brought about questions of their own statements, their own data.
I think that's an important follow-up to what Lisa was saying earlier as well about the net present value approach to evaluating a municipal network. Now, our argument is, and the data supports us, that most municipal networks have paid all their bills. They have not had to resort to subsidies in any way. They're meeting their business plans. They've also created a ton of side benefits. But we do concede that some networks may not fit that description, in that using the net present value methodology that Professor Yu used in this other study by the University of Pennsylvania Law School, even then, you may find some communities that appear to have a negative net present value, but it's still a wise investment when you actually calculate all of the side benefits, all of the money that stays in the community because of lower costs, all of the extra things that maybe you have better low-income access. Maybe you're better able to connect schools at a lower price because you control the network. There's so many other benefits. You need a wider approach to this. But I think what Lisa is saying is absolutely correct, that even when you use their measurement techniques, which we think are flawed and don't tell the whole picture, their analysis still shows that most municipal networks are doing well.
And for a lot of non-technical folks out there who maybe don't care too much about the way that these academics are using a certain measurement or they're employing this, these misinformation campaigns are having a real impact. The Taxpayer Protection Alliance focused on Alabama and the specific law or a bill that would have expanded the territory from Opelika Public Service. And there are a number of different legislatures that they are exerting influence on by ginning up fear and stoking public ignorance.
Right, because they know when the Taxpayer Protection Alliance releases a map that has just incredibly flawed data that they obviously didn't fact check because they might have noticed that they put several of the communities in the wrong state. Whoops. They know that a legislator in Alabama does not have the time to call Rockport, Maine to say, hey, did you guys really lose $2.5 million on your investment? But I happen to know the town manager of Rockport, Maine, and saw his reaction when he was just incredulous and saying, we spent a total of $60,000 and it was an incredibly good investment. Like, we're very happy we made that investment. I have no idea how they could claim that we lost $2.5 million. So they can just make things up and assume that legislators or city council members and others will either not have the time or the willingness to go and to actually interview people that actually know the true facts.
Not to mention the fact that the residents of Sandy, Oregon would be shocked to learn that their dot on the map would be in Washington. So I think
actually it was Utah. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's even better.
It could have been anywhere, though. Who knows? Sandy could be anywhere.
All right. Well, I think we're getting to the end of this segment here, and so I just wanted to open it up. Do you have any recommendations for our listeners, reading, listening, anything like that?
So fitting with my reputation around here and the fact that we've been talking about fiction, let me recommend two things that deal with both sort of autonomous vehicles. One is Fate of the Furious, which is the most recent movie in the Fast and the Furious franchise, of which I believe I own everything that's available to watch in that series. And the other is a book called Kill Decision by Daniel Suarez, which is about drones and I think has a particularly bleak picture about what could happen, with some of this technology, depending on how power is centralized around the country, around the world in terms of big corporations. Kill Decisions, it's a few years old, and Daniel Suarez, I think, is a really great author of technical thrillers today from a computer science kind of perspective. But let me just encourage you to read everything he's written except for Influx.
That's great. Lisa?
I just love the fact that you recommended one of those Fast and Furious movies.
So good.
So let me jerk us back to semi-reality. This is a book by Angus Roxburgh. It's about Vladimir Putin, and it's called Strongman. And if you are interested in all of this rigmarole about what's been going on with our current administration, it sort of explains why this is such a big thing. I know that there's a lot of people who think that, it's great if we have great relations with Russia. And then you learn a little bit more about the man in charge, and you'll understand why it might not be such a great thing. So anyway, that's an interesting and revealing book. I thought it was very educational. The author is a British journalist, and he spent some time also working for Vladimir Putin in communications. So he has sort of an inside track as to how things work over there. So it's an interesting book.
Spasiba, Lisa. I'll give my recommendation as well. So I've been reading the trade versions of the new Black Panther series that Ta-Nehisi Coates is writing. It's called The Nation Under Our Feet. And at this moment, you might be saying to yourself, I'm not going to read a comic book, but he tackles a lot of themes of the way the government works, the different relationships to autonomy and power, and the way that people's fears can be stoked to doing things that they could never dream of. I would recommend it. The first 3 volumes are out. You can get them from local retailer. They're all over the place. It's great. And I'll also recommend the United States of Anxiety podcast. They're back with a new series called Culture Wars. And they have a recent episode where they talk about ignorance as a tool in American political life and how you can talk down to intellectuals and how that's been a very popular theme throughout American history that I would definitely recommend for this moment in time.
Yes, I've been listening to that show. I thought that was a good episode, and I second that. And let me just say that I think that Ta-Nehisi Coates is well worth reading, even if you don't agree with him, because I think he really, you hear sometimes people talk about a voice of a generation. he is a voice of people that rarely are heard. And even if you, like I said, even if you don't agree with them, I think it's important to know what they're thinking. In similar veins, I just listened to a podcast interview with Carly Fiorina, and I could not disagree with her more on some points, and I could not agree with her more on some other points. But I'm just glad to know what she's thinking, because we're such a large country. We need to stop thinking right or wrong. We need to start thinking about perspectives that people have who are different from us.
All right. And on that note, thank you so much, Chris and Lisa, for joining us on the Building Local Power podcast.
Thank you.
Gracias, Nick.
We'll hope you join us next episode for another great discussion and a great way to build local power. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Building Local Power. We had a roundtable discussion with a number of ILSR's experts, and you can follow them all on Twitter. You can follow Stacy Mitchell at Stacy F. Mitchell. You can follow John Farrell at John F. Farrell. You can follow Chris Mitchell at Community Nets, and you can follow Lisa at LisaMG07. You can also follow all of the updates from ILSR at ILSR on Twitter, and make sure to go to iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever else you find your podcast to rate and recommend this podcast to all of your friends and family.